don't give you a fright by not turning up there. I don't know what, is it Christmas? The underground is just impossible. Oh, brilliant. It's brilliant to be here, of course. I always find it an absolute honour, pleasure, privilege to be at a National Secular Society event, because I think it's such an important space, given all that you said in your introduction. But I'm particularly pleased to be here today because I do believe that one of the most urgent struggles taking place around the world in a variety of contexts is the struggle for women's rights in the face of religious rights. That's all right. So at this political juncture, events around the world, I think, are showing more and more, increasingly that the struggle for feminism and the struggle for secularism are inextricably linked. I'm going to talk largely about the UK context, because that's what I know best. And because I think most of us here have a responsibility to do what we can in our local context. So in the UK, ever since the Salman Rushdie affair burst onto our scenes in 1989, we have witnessed the steady rise of religious fundamentalist movements in all religions. And we have witnessed at the same time a revival of religious identity. I don't think it's an accident that the rise of political religious power in state institutions is happening at the same time as we're seeing revival of religious identity. And I think the rise of religious identity, particularly, or the rise of religious political power in state institutions, is actually what defines religious fundamentalist movements. So I guess I should start by saying what I mean by fundamentalist movements. These are basically political movements that have a religious imperative, and they seek in various ways, in differing circumstances, to harness modern state and media powers to the service of their gospel. I mean in a wider sense. Their interpretation of the gospel or religion is presented as the only valid form of religion. It can rely heavily on sacred religious texts, but it can also be more experiential and linked to specific charismatic leaderships. So fundamentalism can align itself with different political trends in different countries. For example, it can align itself to nationalistic trends, which is what we're seeing in India, for example, at the moment. And it manifests itself in many forms. It can appear as a form of orthodoxy, a maintenance of traditional values, or as a revivalist, radical phenomenon, dismissing impure and corrupt forms of religion to return to original sources. And of course, wherever there has been the rise of religious fundamentalist movements, there has also been corresponding increase in the rise of fundamentalist violence, particularly against women. And I won't go into it, but one example is, for example, the 2002 atrocities in Gujarat, Western India, where you saw over 2,000 Muslim men, women and children systematically killed, raped and tortured by Hindu mobs linked to Narendra Modi, who is the chief minister of that state, and his Hindu supremacist party, the BJP and other affiliated Hindu fascist organizations and parties. And I do not mince my words, because this man is about to become the next Prime Minister of India. And he is being feted across Europe and the UK as a modernizer, in quotation marks. But what is forgotten is that he presided over systematic genocide against Muslim men, women and girls. And testimonies from survivors talk of women, Muslim women, including pregnant women, being gang raped or having instruments inserted into their bodies, of sexual assaults, of their vaginas and wombs being sliced open, of being beaten up with rods and pipes, young Muslim girls, even as young as the age of 3, were raped and killed, often in front of their mothers. So this man, this butcher, this Slobodan Milosevic of Gujarat, is about to become the head of the largest democracy in the country. When the elections take place next year, we hope against hope that he will be defeated, but we worry about what's happening. Of course, closer to home, in the UK, we have also witnessed the revival of religion as the main marker of identity, a framework by which the needs of minority communities have been articulated and addressed. And it's particularly with reference to minority communities that the problem becomes acute. It's led to the greater accommodation of religion within state institutions and in the wider public culture. And it reflects itself in a number of global, national, economic, political, social trends. But the groups that have tended to dominate as mediators in the development of a new social contract between state and minority communities are authoritarian and conservative, if not fundamentalist. The demands for a seat at the public table are particularly disturbing because what they seek to do is to redefine religious values and identities so that they are compatible with their own reactionary, patriarchal, anti-democratic worldview. And these fundamentalists often masquerade as moderates, but there is nothing moderate about their views on women, or sexual minorities, or even other religious minorities. And there's nothing moderate about their views on female sexuality in particular. And what they seek to do is to impose strict religious identities that encourage gender apartheid and force women to retreat into the private sphere of their home, in other words, not to have a public presence. It is no accident that in the last decade or so, internal dissent against religious fundamentalists and orthodox values, that's internal within minority communities, have largely focused on the need to discipline women and to control female sexuality. So if we look at the key flashpoints in the UK, we can see that they've all been articulated in the name of the right to manifest religion, but actually what they're about is the control of female sexuality. From the Beasley play, which involves Sikh fundamentalists in Birmingham who successfully opposed the staging of a play on rape in a Sikh temple, to the imposition of veiling and Sharia laws on women and girls, women's bodies have become key to the assertion of religious and communal identities. This political use of religion has often also involved the appropriation of progressive and secular language and the spaces that have been actually created through struggle for democracy and equality by many, including black minority women. For instance, religious fundamentalists and moderates alike are engaged in substituting the demand for racial equality with the demand for religious literacy. That is, they demand that the state recognizes the supposedly authentic theological values and traditions of minority communities, but not recognize the diverse, syncretic, liberal, cultural, political, religious, and even secular traditions, including feminist traditions, within minority communities. So alternative traditions are in danger of being obliterated by the shift from multiculturalism to multi-faithism, which has of course benefited from and even accelerated under successive British government agendas on cohesion, integration, and now the big society. So in other words, the struggle for secularism, if that is your political economic context, is directly linked to the struggle for gender justice and racial equality, which under the shadow of the war on terror, neoliberal economics and politics is being severely undermined. I think at this point I should make clear to many who argue that secularism is a Western concept. I would say, in response, secularism is a concept that is not alien to minorities or to those who live in ex-colonies. Indeed, in many parts of the world, the struggle against colonialism was also a struggle for democratic and secular societies. Should we take the example of South Africa and the ANC, or the Indian Congress Party under the leadership of Gandhi and Nehru? These were struggles for democracy as much as a struggle for secularism. And of course, in the course of engaging in those struggles, the meaning of secular values was transformed. So even if the concept has its roots in Western Enlightenment, it has evolved through struggles against colonialism. And it is vital that we, meaning feminists and others, do not forget that history by seeking to distance ourselves from the struggle for secularism. Why? Because what we are witness to is a process of redefinition from above, the state, and below, religious fundamentalist leaders, which is resulting in a diminishing welfare state on the one hand, and on the other hand, the communalization of minority communities. And by communalization, what I'm referring to is how community groups and civil society are organizing solely around religious identities. This desecularization process is extremely damaging to struggles for democracy and human rights, especially women's human rights. And Anne-Marie talked about what's happening at the international level at the UN. But it's also harmful to our struggles in our communities and in family institutions. It encourages the state to relate to minorities, not as citizens, but as subjects defined only by reference to their religious identity, which is increasingly defined by religious fundamentalists. It prevents us from uniting with others on the basis of need, and weakens our struggles against racism, equality, and gender justice, based on universal values of human rights. Some say defending secularism and opposing the role of religion in the state feeds into racism and imperialism, and that it doesn't acknowledge the positive role religion can and has played. I suppose you have to think about the Desmond Tutus of this world and how you locate him in the context of what we're talking about. My answer to the accusation that defending secularism means feeding racism and imperialism is that it's diatribe. It is always trotted out against us. As black and minority women, we have faced these accusations many times whenever we have struggled against issues like domestic violence or sexual violence. We're always told that we're being divisive and that we're playing into the hands of racism and imperialism. At best, we are told now is not the time to raise these issues, or at worst, we are traitors to the anti-racist or anti-imperialist cause. There are many, including on the so-called progressive left, who say that in the post-9/11 climate defined by the rise in anti-Muslim racism, defending secularism is tantamount to supporting racism and imperialism. I think we should respond to that in a number of ways, or at least I will. Firstly, conceptualizing secularism as anti-religion is a false premise. Secularism is not about the absence of religion in people's individual lives. Secularism is essentially about delinking religion from political power in the family and the community and in state institutions. Religion cannot be allowed to define our roles and our values because it is based on a hierarchy of power and inequality in itself. It will always limit the freedom of those who are seen as threatening, such as women, sexual minorities, and indeed other religious minorities. Religion can and does play a positive role in the lives of the many abused women that we see at SBS. But that doesn't translate into a desire on their part to have their needs met through religion. In fact, many see religion as a personal matter, but not as the basis for receiving legal and welfare services, which they wish to remain secular and free from religious power and pressure exercised by unaccountable, corrupt patriarchs. In 2009, 2010, SBS conducted a small study to shed light on whether or not the revival of religion constitutes the counter-voice of the many black minority women who we see who need help to secure their rights in contexts where they're vulnerable and marginalised. We carried out 21 in-depth interviews with women from different religious backgrounds, and the results can be found in our Cohesion, Faith and Gender report. And it shows that the vast majority of the women were acutely critical and even fearful of aspects of their tradition and culture and religion that perpetuate gender inequality, discrimination and violence. And although most of them were believers, and they often turned to religion for spiritual sustenance, none expressed any sense of belonging to a faith community. The study showed that women actually are involved in negotiating and contesting their identities on a daily basis. And this is precisely why they cherish the secular space provided by SBS, which they experience as an empowering space, and a space that enables them to have access to other ideas, traditions, cultures, and more importantly, a space that unlocks their access to secular state services, including the legal and welfare system, which they regard as the final safety net in their struggle against discrimination and in their struggle to assert their fundamental human rights. What these women's voices tell us is that religion can have a positive role to play, but if, and only if, it is willing to align itself to the demand for a democratic and secular state in which the rights of all are guaranteed. And that's where I place the likes of Desmond Tutu, for example. He wasn't anti-democratic, he was aligning himself with the need for a secular democratic South Africa. Secularism is important for women's freedoms, but it is also important for others who are also marginalized, including other religious minorities, because it's actually under secularism that we create the potential to guarantee freedom of worship for all. However, what we recognize also is that secularism in itself doesn't guarantee anything. It is important, the demand for the separation of church and state, but it's not sufficient precondition, although a necessary one. The demand for secularism must, out of necessity, also be tied to the demand for democracy and equality. And the reason for that is to prevent it sliding itself into authoritarianism and totalitarianism. Secondly, if we don't defend secular values and instead embrace religious ones, we'll be guilty of developing counter-resistance strategies against racism and imperialism that actually hide other forms of oppression. Religion can't be embraced as a framework for articulating disaffection and alienation, or as a framework for addressing questions of equality and rights, since at its very foundation, it is based on recognizing some rights but not others. And we see this most clearly played out in the clash that Anne-Marie referred to between the right to manifest religion and the right to be free from religion, and what happened at the example of the universities, UK, governing body, and their capitulation to the demand for gender segregation in respect of external visiting speakers. That response that the UKK made is actually a response, a victory for Islamist groups who have been the most vociferous in making demands for gender apartheid. The UKK has justified its position on the grounds that universities need to accommodate the genuinely held wishes or beliefs of those who are religious, and states that this arrangement, as long as is not discriminatory, as long as both men and women are segregated in the same way. I don't quite follow that logic. It would appear that the UKK, the universities in the UK are ignorant of the history and struggles against racial discrimination based on the flawed logic of separate but equal. Such logic legitimized racial apartheid in South Africa. I think it's a really poignant moment at this very moment when we're all mourning the death of one of the greatest secularists, I think, and democrats of our age or any age. What the UKK have done is they've failed to recognise that the stance will allow the right to manifest religion, which always has to be a qualified right, to trump the right to be free from gender discrimination and violence and subjugation, which surely must be absolute rights. So what we mustn't do is capitulate to this kind of lazy, expedient thinking that argues that supporting demands for a secular state is fueling Western imperialism. Instead, we have to find the courage and vision to fight racism, imperialism, and religious fundamentalism at the same time, which means being alert to those who seek to undermine the relevance of secularism for minorities, and it means being alert to those who use it to mask a language of majoritarianism and ethnocentrism. So what I mean by that is I refer to those who use secularism to promote a racist discourse. In parts of Europe we're seeing that, and in the UK actually, about minorities, particularly where they tend to emphasise European or so-called British values and the Christian character of a state in order to exclude and demonise and discriminate others. But taking this position doesn't make us complicit in anti-Muslim racism or in other forms of racism. Quite frankly, I don't think we can afford any longer to put up with the argument that now is not the time to raise these things. Because in the silence that ensues, we hide our own forms of fascism, which we then are not willing to recognise, and I think that's a very dangerous path to tread. Thirdly, the idea that secularism is a Western concept and aiding imperialism. Well, actually, I think it's the accusation itself that panders to colonial and racial discourses of minorities. Why? Because it assumes that minorities can only be defined by their religious identity. And this stance denies the very real, urgent human rights struggles that are taking place around the world by ordinary people everywhere, many in the ex-colonies themselves. And if anyone is in any doubt, take a look at the recent book by the feminist and human rights scholar Karima Benoun entitled "Your Fatwa Doesn't Apply Here Anymore." She documents hundreds of everyday struggles waged by individual men and women, including politicians, writers, artists, activists, intellectuals, against religious fundamentalism across the Muslim world. She argues that their struggles stand for and seek to create secular human rights and democratic values, but that these struggles have been largely ignored, if not silenced, including by those who see themselves as anti-imperialists, and that the silence that is imposed is to devastating effect. She pleads for the need to bear witness to the countless forms of resistance that is taking place every day against fundamentalist violence. Nor are these struggles, I have to add, inherent to Muslims, but can be found wherever religion seeks political power. So I would like to just end by taking one moment, if I may, to tackle one other development, and this is in feminism itself. This is where some feminists from minority backgrounds talk of the need to develop a feminism that is sensitive to the growth of religious values, especially in the light of anti-Muslim racism. But these so-called religious feminists or pious feminists are actually seeking to work within the religious frameworks to make demands for the recognition of religious identity paramount. So although they see themselves as religious and as feminists, actually what they're doing is making the recognition for the right of religious identity to be paramount over the need for substantive gender equality. And this trend towards developing a religious-based feminism absolutely makes no sense in the context like the British context, where secular spaces still exist, and where there is a long, rich and vibrant tradition of secular feminism in the UK. It makes more sense in countries where there are no spaces for women to contest and resist, except through religion, Saudi Arabia, Iran perhaps, but it doesn't make sense in the British context at all. Why doesn't it make sense? Well, without a shadow of doubt, over the last 3 decades, it's secular black and minority women's projects across the UK that have been the driving force behind successful campaigns and services for women who have experienced gender-based violence, including specific cultural and religious forms of harm, by establishing advice centres, counselling services, refuges. Black and minority women have challenged community norms that reproduce a culture of denial and silence. In the process, we have developed the analysis and the experience needed to challenge state and community practices that justify and excuse violence against women. Although often operating in contexts of great hostility, these efforts have led to new laws, improved legal interventions, and they've helped to create statutory guidelines on a range of issues, from domestic violence to forced marriage to honour crimes and child abuse. And it is this work, and not the work of religious and community leaders or institutions, that has led to increased awareness and to progress in respect of black minority women's human rights. Yet despite this track record, religious forms of feminisms have emerged as a countervoice to so-called Western secular feminism. And our critique that these religious feminisms and their demand for greater religious recognition in state institutions, for example, the right to wear the veil or the right to seek a divorce through Sharia courts, our critique of those demands, that these are actually endorsing gender apartheid, is met with an accusation that we are denying Muslim female agency. And yet I think the question that we have to ask when that counter-accusation is made against us is which social and political forces are at play in these demands? And who defines religious values and for what purposes? These questions are rarely asked. Instead, notions of community and autonomy, the cornerstone of feminist analysis, embodied in campaigns for freedom, especially in the private sphere, are being used to shore up a reactionary, regressive, multi-faith framework. So we should be very wary of demands for separate religious laws to govern family matters in minority communities, because what they're doing is creating the conditions for the establishment of parallel legal systems. And that's exactly why the Vatican and Iran opposed what they did at the international level. These are systems that uphold rather than interrogate patriarchal power. So discussions of female Muslim agency have to be placed within their proper context, which is transnational religious, political and social movements from which those demands come out. They give rise to the kind of demands that are being made. And the critical point that is ignored is that female agency is constrained and framed through religious political forces, and that what we are witness to is the unfolding of a bigger power struggle for the control of female sexuality and women's freedoms and rights more generally. So, conclusion, religious fundamentalism poses a serious threat to the universality of human rights and to the secular fabric of the legal and other public institutions that are so central in gaining access to justice and protection, particularly for vulnerable groups like women and other marginalized people. My friend and colleague Gita Sego said in an interview recently, the religious fundamentalists represent the destruction of the most fundamental of all human rights principles, liberty and equality. And I think she's dead right. This is why the struggle for secularism is so directly linked to the struggle for women's rights but it is also directly linked with the struggle for racial equality and democracy generally. Thank you.